Okay, I was driving a white minivan traveling down the road on one of those amazing sunny winter afternoons in Colorado, just driving through the countryside. I was happily listening to a conversation taking place in between one of my best friends, Joshua Waller, and another gentleman that we'd met earlier that day while we were speaking at a presentation sharing about our volunteer work in Israel. So this particular gentleman was interested in joining us in Israel for the pruning trip to prune the grapevines in Israel. And Joshua was just helping him prepare for what to expect during the trip, telling him what things were going to be like when he arrived in Israel. The serenity of the moment was abruptly interrupted as we heard this loud bang in the back of the vehicle and all this clatter of noise. And so I quickly pull the van over to the side of the road, and we all jump out to see what's going on. And we go back to the back tire, and we see the tire's blown out. And so we quickly jump in and start jacking the car up and replacing the spare tire. And eventually the former conversation begins again. And Joshua just explained to this gentleman that during our volunteer trips, his father, Tommy Waller, would be sharing like a Bible lesson every morning during breakfast. And this guy said, "Hey, everything about the trip sounds fantastic, sounds really great. I have one request. During the Bible teachings, don't teach about the restoration of the temple." And Joshua began to answer, kind of come up with an answer for it, and I just had to interrupt. I jumped in there and said, "What do you mean? Why don't you want us to talk about the redemption or the restoration of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem?" And the guy said, "Fine, tell me, why should I as a Christian care about the rebuilding of the temple?" And so I began in my mind, it's like time kind of slowed down and froze as I'm trying to come up with an answer to this question. And to be honest, I hadn't really seriously thought about this topic. I hadn't really thought so much about the temple before in my life. And but I had a couple Bible verses, so I was trying to bring those up to mind. And I realized, I can give some kind of answer to him, but I'm really not prepared to give like a direct, solid answer to this question. And I purposed in my mind right then, tomorrow I'm going to sit down and I'm going to begin doing an in-depth study on this topic about what's the temple, why is it important? And right at that moment, when I made that commitment, boom, I woke up. Turns out I wasn't actually in Colorado after all. I was sitting in my bunk in Har Bracha, Israel. It was my first Shabbat back in the land, and I just had this visceral dream. And as I woke up, I looked over at the clock. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. And I had this resounding phrase reverberating in my mind: "Zeal for your house has consumed me." And so I opened up the Bible and began pursuing, where is this coming from? What is this? And so this dream sparked a passion in my life to study the temple and the significance of it. So that phrase, "zeal for your house consumes me," is found in the New Testament book of John, in John 13. I'll just read it for you here. It says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold the doves, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise.' Then his disciples remembered that it was written in the Psalms, 'Zeal for your house has eaten me up.'" And so I just want to kind of dive into this passage a little bit. And at one point in my life, I probably would have read this passage and looked at it this way. So, one day Jesus is going to Jerusalem, and he's going to Jerusalem. He's really excited because, there's a feast, and it's Jerusalem. There's going to be lots of people there, and he has a message to deliver. And Jerusalem's the perfect place to do it because there's thousands of people that have gathered together. And lo and behold, he decides to go up to the Temple Mount, obviously because it's the largest, gathering place in town, and he's going to be able to speak to a lot of people there, right? So he goes on up there, and what does he find? In the courtyards, which usually you have groups of people teaching and things going on. This is, a holy place, a place of prayer and study and teaching. And what does he find there? He finds this marketplace. He finds sheep and cows. He tries to talk, but the cows are making a bunch of noise, and he's moving around, and maybe he steps in a pile of cow dung. He's like, "That's it. This is the last straw." And he just goes to town, lets all the, he grabs a rope, makes a cord, and starts driving the animals out of there. and clearing it out. And he says that this is supposed to be a house of prayer, this is supposed to be a place of teaching, but you guys have made it a den of thieves. So that's kind of one way, probably at some point in my life. I think in the past I've kind of looked at it that way. It's like, yeah, you know, he was passionate about the temple because it was, you know, it was the focal point. So many people were there, and it was the perfect opportunity to be able to speak. But this whole scene with Jesus' behavior here is definitely out of character. It's not something that we see. You know, he's the man who's renowned in the world for bringing a message of love, and here we see him acting with maybe anger, with this zealousness. What's really going on in this place? And does Yeshua have a deeper connection to the temple than just as being a gathering place for people to pray and to teach? So as we look through the Gospels, we see all throughout the Gospels numerous times where it talks about Jesus going up to the Temple Mount, going up during the feast. And we see that this is something that Jesus was actually connected to from like the very foundation of his life. And the temple was something that he was very passionate about. We first see Jesus at the temple when he was an infant. The book of Luke describes Jesus' parents bringing him up to the temple in order to have the firstborn redemption ceremony take place. And we see this righteous man, Simeon, who we could suppose is probably the Levite or the priest who performed the ceremony, raises Yeshua up and prophesies over his destiny of what he's going to do in the world. So within the first few weeks of his life, Jesus was at the temple. The next time we see Jesus at the temple is when he's 12 years old. He goes up with his family to Jerusalem during the Feast of Passover to celebrate the feast. And this is really kind of where we begin to get a picture of Jesus' lifelong passion for the temple. So the festival had ended, right? His parents had gone away, but Jesus didn't go with his parents, and they find that out a day later, right? But where was he? He was in the temple. He was sitting there for 3 days. It says that they searched for him all over, trying to find him. But he had spent 3 days sitting in the temple, and what was he doing? He was sitting there with the sages of Israel, learning from them. And we can actually see the things that Jesus was learning from the sages replete throughout the other messages that he gives once he starts his ministry. You know, 20-something years from after this point, we see a lot of his message was actually paraphrasing or quoting the sages that he would have sat around in the temple back when he was 12 years old. And it says that the people were amazed at his understanding, at the questions that he was asking. So he was a young Torah scholar from the very beginning. When his parents finally found him, they were exasperated, like, look at what you've put us through. And Jesus gave like a very straightforward, simple answer. He said, didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house? And so this is just a quick thing. We see that Jesus was involved in the temple throughout his life. If you want to go more in depth in that, in your handouts, John Anderson has written a great article titled, Jesus Loved the Temple Mount, Do You? So he goes into more in depth there. Since it's Hanukkah, I'll note one verse in John chapter 10, verse 22. We see that Jesus came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Hanukkah. And in verse 22, it says, now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So not only was he here during the other feasts where it's biblically mandated for the men of Israel to be in the temple, Jesus was coming here at other times as well. So we see that Jesus loved the Temple Mount, that he viewed it as more than just something that's a gathering place, but he was really connected to it as his Father's house, as he referred to it. And we see like he really acted with zeal, as we talked about the cleansing of the temple earlier. This is something that he was very passionate about. But in Christianity, we've said, okay, well, yeah, maybe Jesus was passionate about the temple, but didn't everything change after his death and resurrection? And so, hey, I would say that's a valid question. Did things change after his death and resurrection? Let's take a look at that. And let's look at how did the apostles, how did the disciples of Jesus behave and relate to the temple after he had ascended. And if it's true that after his death and resurrection that everything changed, it kind of seems like if we look through the book of Acts that somebody forgot to communicate that to the disciples. And so to go into that, I want to come with me back 2,000 years ago, and we're going to meet a young man named David. The last 2 months of David's life have been a roller coaster of experience. It all started when David left his home in Modi'in and came up to Jerusalem to be with his aunt and uncle who had a house there in the city of Jerusalem. So David came a week before the feast of Passover to help his aunt prepare the house to be able to have all of these guests that would be coming to Jerusalem for the feast. And so he's there helping prepare for the feast, and David was working very diligently to prepare the house. But oddly enough, it's the day before Passover, and they have no registrants. Nobody's RSVP'd and said, hey, we want to stay at your house. So they're a little bit concerned. They offer up a prayer. So I woke up early on the eve of Passover and busied myself with the preparations for the feast. On my aunt's request, I headed outside to fetch some water. And as I returned back home, I looked behind me just before I entered the house, and I realized that I had been followed home by two men. I greeted them, and they asked to speak with the master of the house. And I observed that these two guys were from Galilee. And I figured, wow, maybe this is an answer to our prayer. God's bringing us some guests. So I ran and grabbed my uncle. And these two men introduced themselves as Peter and John. They told my uncle, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room that I may eat the Passover with my disciples? So we brought them upstairs to the large room which we had prepared for just this occasion. And they looked around the room and said this would be perfect, exactly what they were looking for. So we quickly began making everything ready for them to be able to celebrate the Passover. And I was excited that the famous teacher from Nazareth and his closest disciples would be eating their Passover at our house. I had heard Jesus speak once or twice before in the temple, and I was really interested to learn more. Well, I'm sure you've heard of how this Passover ended in tragedy as the Romans crucified Jesus at the request of the Sadducean leaders. His disciples all went into hiding, but they continued to meet secretly in my aunt and uncle's upper room. I was there the night when Jesus suddenly appeared, proving that he had risen from the dead. And 10 days ago, we all stood at the Mount of Olives and watched as Jesus ascended up into heaven. The last instruction that he gave to us was for us to return to the city of Jerusalem and to wait for the coming promises from the Father. He told us that we'd be filled with the Holy Spirit. So we went back to the city and were engaged in the worship of the temple. We were, the disciples, we were afraid of what the authorities might do if they caught us, but the temple and participating in the worship service there was so important that we continued to do that. So I woke up this morning with a sense of eager anticipation. The day of Pentecost had finally arrived, or Shavuot as we call it in Hebrew. The city of Jerusalem was filled with tens of thousands of people gathered together to worship at the temple. You saw Israelites carrying baskets of fruit on their shoulders. You saw, and others were leading sheep and oxen up towards the Temple Mount, beautifully arrayed. Like the oxen had crowns. It was amazing. And all these people coming, and not only just the Israelites, but people from all around the nations, just as God had instructed in his Torah for every Israelite man to be present during the feast. So, and the air was filled with sounds, with singing as the pilgrims went up and were singing along to the lovely songs. I joined the throng in the streets and made my way towards the Temple Mount to witness the offerings being made in the temple and to join in the morning prayers. As I go up, I can't help but feel like I am somehow a first fruit of the Messiah's labor. Climbing up the large steps up onto the mountaintop, I'm filled with wonder, observing the great and beautiful magnificence of this place. And that term, the place, what a meaningful phrase to ponder on. All throughout the Bible, the Temple Mount is referred to as the place. When our forefathers Abraham and Isaac came here, they refer to it. It says that they saw the place from afar. And when Moses talks about the temple, or the future temple, throughout the book of Deuteronomy, he refers to it as the place where the Lord your God will choose to place his name for his dwelling place. King David shares his burning desire to build a dwelling place for the Lord. I am so blessed and privileged to walk in the footsteps of the patriarchs, the prophets, and now to ascend to this holy place. As I emerge from the tunnel and step foot onto the southern court of the Temple Mount, I pause to take in the beautiful scene before me. I see the buildings of the temple blazing white in the sun. I see the smoke from the pillar of smoke from the altar rising miraculously up in a straight pillar up to heaven. Thousands of people are smiling as they make their way towards the inner courts of the temple. The air is filled with the sounds of incredible music, harps and lyres and trumpets and flutes, and most of all, the thousands of Levites who are singing a 12-part harmony to the Psalms of David. The world has never heard a sound such as this, and my soul soars. On top of that, you just take in a breath of the air, and you can sense and just breathe in the incense. The temple incense permeates everything, and there's nothing in the world that compares to its sweetness. You can literally feel the energy, the joy, the anticipation of the multitude. As I continue, I can't help but wonder, am I in heaven or am I still on earth? One of the Levites approaches me, welcoming me to the house of God, asking about my well-being and giving me a personal blessing. I finally arrived to our normal meeting spot, there in Solomon's porch, looking directly into the courts of the temple. I look up and I see the sun reflecting off the pendant hanging above the door of the temple. I turn around and I look behind me towards the Mount of Olives. I see the spot where Jesus ascended just 10 days ago, and I wonder when I will see him returning again. I try to imagine the mountain splitting in two as Zechariah prophesies. As I turn back, I see that many of the apostles, the 120 disciples of Jesus, have now arrived. We came in small groups, kind of fearing that we could be caught by the authorities, but once we got to the mount, we couldn't help but gather together. So there, just in front of the temple, just before the prayer service, we all gathered together, 120 of us. I noticed a group of Jews forming to our right. Appears like they're from Libya, and over here on this other side, it looks like here's a group of Jews from Rome. As all these different groups get together, people from their local cities, and begin to join together for the morning prayer service. We quiet down as James the righteous, the brother of our teacher Jesus, steps forward to lead us in the morning prayers. As the priests prepare the offering to offer the first lamb of the day, we join together in one accord as we recite the prayers. The sense of unity is palpable. I feel so closely connected to God's divine presence. The prayer service concludes. As the prayer service is concluding, we suddenly hear a great sound like a mighty rushing wind. The sound fills the entire house and spreads to the courtyards, including the portico where we're standing. We suddenly see what appear like flames of fire, which come and settle over each one of our heads. I feel totally immersed in God's presence. I am overwhelmed by an immense understanding and feeling of God's profound and unconditional love for me. The feeling of love overflows into a tremendous feeling of joy. I cannot contain the passion, and a song of praise bursts forth from the core of my being. Heaven has come to earth. This must be the key that Yeshua was talking about in his message of the kingdom of heaven. I look up and realize that thousands of people are looking at us. A few minutes ago, I'd have been terrified by such a thing, fearing what could happen if we were arrested. But now, I'm completely transformed by the power of God's love. I turn to one man from Libya to explain what has just occurred, and I'm shocked to find myself speaking in his native tongue. I smile and realize that the kingdom of heaven is coming to earth, and nothing can stop it. Wow. So this is like an eye-opening perspective. And if we do a careful reading of the book of Acts chapter 2 from its original Jewish context, we can certainly see that the text clearly indicates that the giving of the Holy Spirit didn't occur in the upper room as we've traditionally thought, but that it actually took place on the holy mountain inside the courts of the temple. And it makes perfect sense as well, because this is the very purpose, the essence of the temple, is to be a place where people can connect to God's presence. When God first gave the command to build the temple, in Exodus chapter 25, he says, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." And the Hebrew word that's translated here as among them is betocham. And here it's translated as among them. But a better translation would really be inside of them, with them. In fact, this is even what some of the Jewish sages interpret this passage as meaning, is that God actually desires, and the purpose of the temple, so that God's Spirit, God's presence can reside within every member of the people of Israel. And so what better place for the outpouring of God's Spirit than to take place in the temple, serving its very core purpose. And if we read through the rest of the book of Acts, we find numerous references to the apostles worshiping in the temple every day. We even see Paul coming to the temple, offering sacrifices, even sin offerings. All of this taking place some 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus. So and if you want to get a better in-depth look at some of the scripture references associated with what I've just explained, you can read Lars Anderson's article on the topic as well, which is also in the book. So I want to go back and look again at that first encounter we had with Jesus when he came onto the Temple Mount. And let's look at it again, from this kind of new light that we've seen of the significance and the importance of the temple. So I like to see Jesus, he's going up to the temple, not just because it's a place to, that a lot of people are gathered and it gives him a good opportunity to speak and to teach, but he's coming there because this is the house of God. The temple represents at the core the message that Jesus brought, this message of love, of harmony, but also justice. Because how can you really have love that's deep and meaningful if there's not a sense of justice? And so we actually see that this perfect balance is one of the things in Christianity that we've kind of lost touch on. It's God's sense, the attribute of God's justice. And justice and love have to be melded together in perfect harmony. And I believe that's what we see Jesus doing as he ascends up to the Temple Mount. He gets up there and he sees that the sacrificial market has been moved from being down on the city streets to being up on the Temple Mount. The problem isn't with the marketplace, because the marketplace is essential to the service that's going on in the temple. The problem is that the marketplace has been relocated into the holy area. And we see actually Jesus is in concert with the view that's expressed by the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel in chapter 43 refers to the entire mountaintop as Kodesh Kodeshim, Holy of Holies. And while, some of the corrupt religious leaders of the day may have thought that, it's the outer courts, it's not really holy, Jesus viewed it as a holy place, the entire mountaintop. And not only that, as we see as he drives the sheep and the oxen away, the thing that Jesus says to those who are changing money and to those who are selling doves, he tells them that this place is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. And what had happened is they had set up the sacrificial market in the court of the nations, the court of the Gentiles. Effectively, what had happened is the corrupt leaders had blocked the non-Jews. They had blocked the nations from being able to come into the house. And that's really the core of what what Jesus was dealing with here, is that this sense of justice, that the nations, they have a place in the temple as well. This isn't just a holy place for the people of Israel. This is a place for the nations, a place of prayer for everyone. And so we have this powerful experience of Jesus actually demonstrating love. And you can see even in his actions, he wasn't just wantonly up there throwing things over. It actually says that he spoke to those who sold doves. It doesn't say that he ripped open the cages and let all the doves go out, because that would have inflicted a monetary loss upon the individuals. But Jesus, in compassion, he told them to take them away. And then we can even just kind of picture this. It says in the book of Mark, it says that Jesus assigned his disciples to go and to guard the gates of the temple to make sure that nobody was bringing the wares back onto the temple. Just kind of imagine that, Matthew, Mark, you guys go over there. And John and Andrew, you over here, guard this gate. And that's part of what's going on here. And it's in perfect concert with Yeshua's message of love, of unconditional love, of drawing us close to the heart of the Father. And the place, the place where that really symbolizes that close, intimate connection with God is the temple. And so Yeshua was filled with zeal and with passion to see his Father's house made a praise in all the world. And so I would encourage all of us, as we go forward from here, is let's take the message of our Master Jesus. Let's go forward and walking forward in acts of unconditional love, to walk forward in chesed. And may we see the temple rebuilt soon in our days. Amen. Amen.